On October 31st, 1992, a new animated series based on Marvel's popular X-Men comic debuted with part 1 of a 2-part pilot. The series would run for 5 years, receiving widespread acclaim and ranking as the #1 Saturday morning kids show. For an entire generation of fans, myself included, it was our first introduction to the world of Marvel's Merry Mutants, and to comic books as a whole. And of course, it would set the stage for the 2000 X-Men film, ushering in a new era of superhero movies. And look, as consistently great as the show would remain over those 5 seasons, I'm here to tell you that the 2-part pilot, titled Night of the Sentinels, is the series at its absolute peak. Hey heroes, I'm Josh from Panels to Pixels, and this is the 90s X-Men cartoon's perfect debut.
Today, the downtown area was rocked by another outbreak of violence. The fact that the perpetrator is believed to be a mutant has fueled current anti-mutant hysteria now growing nationwide.
Alright, so the show opens on a news report about a rogue mutant who, X-Men fans will recognise as Sabretooth, but a rogue mutant causing chaos in the city. And there's something kind of unsettling about this, Right from the off, the show opens with this sense of civil unrest, and there's something vaguely dystopian about this cold city backdrop, and the fear and anxiety and paranoia around, this mutant going crazy. It's really interesting how the city scene is juxtaposed against the paranoid suburbia. You have the idyllic suburban home of Jubilee's foster parents. There's something very Fox News about it all, to be honest. This news report and these, little middle Americans in the suburban house looking frightened about it. Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but I feel like this intro is really strong and it sells the central premise. Mutants exist in this world, and rationally or not, humans are afraid of them. The whole X-Men show had a challenge, right up front. It had to sell to kids this idea of, that the mutants are marginalized and ostracized, and it has to present them as something that humans are legitimately afraid of, but we also, kids need to understand right from the beginning that, there's nothing to be afraid about, they're misunderstood. And that's, there's a lot of nuance there, there's a lot that has to be conveyed to a kid audience. And I think it's done really tactfully and subtly here. One of the strengths of the show is I think it communicates a lot of these ideas through atmosphere and feeling, rather than just saying, as a more traditional cartoon would do, these are the good guys and these are the bad guys, these are the heroic, big, strong people and these are the ugly people, because that is like the antithesis of what the X-Men is all about, It's about, creating more nuance between who's good and who's bad, and, maybe the good guys don't look like regular humans, and maybe the bad guys do look like regular humans, and it's flipping all that stuff. But what this show does really well, and what it continues to do throughout the show, is it's all tonal, this stuff, it's context, and again, it's communicated through atmosphere. And speaking of atmosphere, again, to sell the central premise, the show's creators had to create a climate of fear. We need to see humans being afraid, and again, Jubilee's foster parents, they work really well in that role. Later on, the eponymous Sentinels become the physical manifestation of humans' fear. And what was really interesting, I was reading this book, and this is going to come up a lot in this video. This is Previously on X-Men, the making of an animated series by the series showrunner Eric Lewald, and I highly recommend this for fans of the show. But he talks in this about how they wanted that first episode to be about mutants versus humans, rather than mutants against other mutants. So that's why Magneto isn't introduced as the first villain in the show, in the first episode. They want to make this like delineation clear between, mutants, i.e. the X-Men, and the humans that fear them, and also the humans who act with malicious intent to kind of capture and research and study and enslave mutants. And that's what we get here. In this episode, we're introduced to Henry Gyrick and Bolivar Trask, and they're the kind of, they're working in tandem with the government to push their anti-mutant agenda. And I think it's really interesting in this episode how mutation is framed as a threat right from the beginning. The first thing we learn about mutants in this episode as it opens is that mutants are a threat and they're being reported as such. That's interesting because the show is about how we as the audience are supposed to empathize and sympathize and grow to love the X-Men who are mutants.
How much that game costs?
Yeah, $25.
We've got to talk about Jubilee, of course. She's kind of the point of view character. Well, not kind of, she is the point of view character. She's the audience surrogate. And it was Marvel's decision to use Jubilee rather than Kitty Pryde, who has served this role previously in the comics. But they function in the same way. And in fact, Rogue, as played by Anna Paquin, would function in the same role in the first X-Men movie. But I guess Marvel wanted to better align it with the current comics, so they made the decision to use Jubilee. I feel like a good pilot, or a good first issue of a comic book, or the good first act of a movie is all about giving the audience a way in. You need to welcome them into this world, and that's what Jubilee is there for. We learn about the X-Men in the same process that she does, and in the same way as she does. And by the end of this two-part pilot, when she's fully on board and she's invited to become a full-time member of the X-Men, that's when we fully understand the X-Men. I think there are some questions about Jubilee's likability in this show. I think maybe people who were a bit older when the show first, ran, they found her a bit annoying, a bit whiny, a bit too kid-like in what was otherwise kind of quite a mature and dark show. But I think it's kind of crucial that she is that bridge between younger audiences and the more mature themes. It puts all these big ideas about discrimination, and later on the show goes on to explore things like the AIDS epidemic and faith, religion, things like that. And it channels them through this kind of like her younger, more naive understanding without being patronizing or pandering to a younger audience. That's really the show's biggest success. I love how Jubilee's clothes, by the way, even once she becomes a member of the X-Men, just her regular clothes. I always saw her wearing the yellow trench coat and the pink glasses and figured, oh, it's like a sci-fi kind of cyberpunky costume that she wears, because all the other X-Men have uniforms. But no, she was just wearing that when she was hanging around in the mall. That's just her regular day-to-day clothes. It's really cool as well that Jubilee is, a Chinese-American female teenager protagonist. I think now in the Twitter age, might be some pushback from certain groups of the fandom, if you can call them fans. They push back about that, but here it's no big deal. It just goes to show that all this manufactured outrage that happens nowadays around superhero media and genre fiction in general, comic books and superheroes, their roots are in holding up the marginalized and especially the X-Men. The X-Men has always been about diversity. Well, particularly since the X-Men as we know them from the 70s onwards, that team was literally designed to be racially and sexually and ethnically diverse. Our first introduction to the X-Men is really cool as well. It's not as them as heroes flying in fully costumed to save the day. We see a little bit of them just out and about on a trip to the mall, and they're in regular clothes and just palling around. That, to me, it captures the best of X-Men comics, especially, this is a big Chris Claremont trope from back in the day. The X-Men just hang about. That's when the real one-to-one interpersonal relationships get developed. Whether they're playing basketball or playing baseball, just hanging around the X-Mansion. Those are the soap opera elements. In that book again, Eric Lewald talks about, he keeps mentioning the word real and how important it was to him for the characters to be real and be realistic, and the world to feel real, and for them not to be cartoonish caricatures. And I think seeing the X-Men as regular humans first, rather than as these, again, big cartoonish superheroes coming in and saving the day, that really sells that. In the show's series Bible, which was distributed to all the writers and the creators who were going to work on the show, Lewald gives this as like a definition of what a good X-Men story is. X-Men is different from most animated action-adventure shows you may have seen or written. It's more about the lives of our characters, heroes and villains alike, than ingenious plots or non-stop, death-defying physical jeopardy. It's not important whether or not a bad guy succeeds in blowing up the Pentagon. What matters is how Wolverine deals with the pain of losing a friend while trying to stop it. We'll come back to that in a minute, but you can see right from the off how much care was put into this adaptation of the X-Men. So the designs for the X-Men themselves are, of course, using the 90s Jim Lee designs, what was popular at the time. And I talked about some of those designs in my previous video about 90s comic costumes that are good, actually. Again, going back to that book, the show's producer, Will Meaney, tells this great story about how they were all set to use the Jim Lee designs because that was popular. And then 1992 rolls around, Jim Lee leaves with a lot of the other Marvel creators to form Image Comics, and suddenly Marvel's telling them, yeah, don't use the Jim Lee designs. And it's clear that Marvel pushed them quite hard not to use the Jim Lee designs, but they were like, no, this is what's popular, this is what's sold a gazillion copies with X-Men issue 1, this is what we're going to go with. And it's great, you know, like those costumes would have been iconic either way, I think, but the animated series is a huge part of that.
You know, I remember when I was 13, had me a boyfriend, till I kissed him.
So just talking about character introductions and development, you know, in the 44 minutes that these 2 episodes encompass, every main member of the X-Men team gets an introduction and, you know, a little story beat or emotional beat to tell us everything we need to know about them. The best example I can think of, although not the only example, is when they're going to the mutant control facility in episode 2, and Rogue opens up about her past experiences and how she discovered her mutant abilities and how it has traumatized her and how it's informed her outlook on things. You know, it's a really emotionally vulnerable and mature emotional beat. You know, we get our introduction to Gambit in the mall, and he is, you know, sleazy, kind of, but charming, and kind of roguish, pardon the pun. And we see Cyclops, you know, he's the kind of like slightly uptight, but stoic hero, the leader. We see Storm again, you know, she's stoic, but she's maternal. She's maternal with Jubilee. That's a really key story beat, is when Storm kind of inducts Jubilee on the roof of the X-Mansion. Beast is the deep thinker. He's, you know, pensive and thoughtful and kind, despite the fact that he's the one who has the most obvious, like, physical mutation. You know, he's the one who sticks out the most. He's the one who couldn't pass in regular society, but, you know, he's kind of the one who seems almost most at peace with himself. Wolverine is kind of scary and grumpy and cantankerous, but there's a real warmth to him, and we see that with his relationship with Morph. You know, they're kind of inseparable best friends, and their relationship is really interesting because Wolverine just finds everything that Morph says hilarious. And it's clear that there's a real brothership and a real kinship between those two. And of course, you know, we have to talk about Morph, and spoiler alert, Morph dies at the end of part 2 of this 2-part pilot. Okay, so Morph is not one of the most recognizable X-Men characters, and I think if you were an X-Men fan going into this show in 1992, you might have been, you know, there might have been some question marks saying, what's this, you know, why is this character here? And once the character dies, you know, you might think, oh, well, they were introduced as cannon fodder. And the truth is that the character does have his origins in the comics as a character called Changeling, and they kind of introduced him, you know, to die. they you know, went looking for the most obscure character that they could kill off, I suppose. But it doesn't make his death any less impactful, you know? And I think the key to that, again, is building up that relationship between him and the rest of the team, making him like the comedy relief of the team. You know, he's the most kind of happy-go-lucky and the most cheerful, and you know, there is something really appealing to him as a kid watching it. He's the kind of the clown of the group, and yet he gets this like mega emotional death. Morph's death is off screen because I think the broadcast standards and practices at the time, they weren't super keen on killing off a superhero in the first 2 episodes. So his death is off screen, but it's sold really well by all the other characters' reactions to it. We see that loss mainly through Wolverine's eyes. Again, you know, they're seen as close all throughout. You know, and he could just be stoic and not react to it and, you know, kind of be a soldier about it, but he has the most emotional reaction to it, and I think that's really interesting to see. That tells us a lot about Wolverine's character right there. You know, he's a soldier, but there's this real emotional core to him. Not to mention the fact that seeing this kind of like uber masculine character cry in the first couple of episodes and you know, be so outwardly emotional, you know, that's really valuable for kids to see. Ultimately, the death of Morph introduces jeopardy and pathos to the show. You know, there are stakes to this, and an X-Men member can die. And more importantly, I think it joins the rest of the team in grief. You know, it really binds them, and it binds us to them. You know, we share that grief with them. Margaret Loesch is really the person who can be thanked most for getting X-Men the Animated Series on the air. She was the head of Fox Kids at the time, and she really championed the X-Men. She'd been wanting to get the X-Men onto TV since the 80s, and you know, there had been attempts, but suddenly she gets made the head of programming at Fox Kids, and she makes it happen. She puts her job on the line to make it happen. Speaking to Inverse just last year on the show's 30th anniversary, she kind of reflects on the debut of the show and says this. We wanted a two-parter to make it a big story. Night of the Sentinels was the perfect introduction to the series because it was really dramatic. There was an emotional hook to it, and one of the characters actually died. That didn't happen on Saturday morning cartoons. And that's really what it's all about, you know. This show, I think it's easy to forget now, but this show broke so much ground for kids' animated shows. You know, even the pace of it was just set piece, set piece, set piece. They took out all the fluff, they took out all the kind of slow pacing that kids' shows had in the 80s and set a new pace for kids' TV shows going forward into the 90s and with the other 90s Marvel TV shows. By the time you get to Spider-Man the Animated Series, that is just relentlessly paced, it's so fast-paced. But that pace was really set by X-Men. And listen, there are so many other reasons why Night of the Sentinels is just a perfect piece of superhero media, in my opinion, and definitely the best of the X-Men animated series. I mean, we haven't even touched on like the most memorable moments and the most quotable lines and all the memes. You know, a lot of them come from these first two episodes. You have Wolverine coming off the Blackbird jet and punching Cyclops in the gut. You know, I'm sure you've seen that GIF. You have Wolverine turning Cyclops' car into a convertible. You have Wolverine crying Morph's name, you know, as he grieves.
This one's for you, Morph.
And then a phrase that has worked its way into my everyday vernacular, which is,
Does a mall baby chili fries?
I think you would struggle to find a better introduction to a group of characters in any media, frankly. And, you know, in the same way that like the MCU gets celebrated for being able to balance so many characters and let them all breathe and let them all have, you know, real moments, this show does exactly that in 1992 in 44 minutes. It's really, really impressive. X-Men the Animated Series, Night of the Sentinels, a perfect debut. Thanks for watching this video, heroes. If you enjoyed this one, make sure to subscribe to Panels to Pixels, and don't forget to give that bell icon a little ring-a-ding-ding. Let me know down in the comments below if you enjoyed this series, if you're a fan of X-Men the Animated Series, and also tell me, does a mall babe eat chili fries? Inquiring minds need to know. As always, take care of yourselves, stay safe, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.